Intel Lunar Lake Core Ultra 200V CPU benchmarks allegedly leak, 17 watts and 30 watts CPU/GPU performance, power explored. New benchmarks of Intel's Core Ultra 200V Lunar Lake CPU have been leaked, exploring the performance and power characteristics of the chip. Another Intel Lunar Lake Core Ultra 200V CPU leaks out, this time focusing on performance and power benchmarks at 17 watts and 30 watts TDPs. The latest numbers come from @JKing0, who has previously revealed the entire alleged Intel Lunar Lake Core Ultra 200V CPU lineup. His latest benchmarks cover the performance and power aspects of an undisclosed Intel Lunar Lake CPU. The Intel Lunar Lake Core Ultra 200V CPUs offer a very similar compute-style configuration with 4 P-cores based on the Lion Cove core architecture and 4 LPE cores based on the Skymont core architecture. There's only one SKU that ships with a PL1/PL2 TDP rating of 30 watts, and that's the top Core Ultra 9 288V. Since this chip can be configured between 17 watts/30 watts, it's easy to say that it's not the flagship. Other major differences include different cache and CPU configurations, with the Core Ultra 7 chips featuring 12MB cache and ARC 140V CPUs, while the Core Ultra 5 chips come with 8MB cache and ARC 130V CPUs. Besides these, the clock speeds are slightly different for each SKU, but since we are looking at a 16GB LPDDR5 x8533 configuration, we can conclude that it is one of the 4 SKUs. 266V/256V/236V/226V. With that out of the way, let's focus on the benchmarks posted by the user, which he states are still preliminary. First up, was have a performance comparison across various tests between the 17 watts and the 30 watts power limits. Do keep in mind that this is the same chip, just that the full 30 watts PL is being used for the second set of benchmarks. Starting with 3DMark Time SPY, the Intel Core Ultra 200V Lunar Lake CPU scores 3,438 points at 17 watts and 4,151 points at 30 watts. That's a 20% performance improvement for a 76% higher TDP. It's not mentioned what score was looking at, as this can either be the overall score or the graphics score. If this is the graphics score, then Lunar Lake's CPUGPU at 30 watts is quite the deal, with performance figures almost on par with the Radeon 890M at its full 54 watts configuration, and the 17 watts configuration sits ahead of the Radeon 780M, 54 watts. Next up, was have the Wildlife Extreme Unlimited benchmark, where the Intel Lunar Lake Core Ultra 200V CPU scores 6,185 points at 17 watts and 7,561 points at 30 watts, marking a 22.2% performance uplift. This is an easy benchmark since the overall score is primarily based on the graphics score. Here, was once again see that the Lunar Lake's CPUGPU at 30 watts tops the CPUGPU chart, but are missing the numbers for the Radeon 890M/880M CPUGPU. Still, it's an impressive score and a very good uplift over the current Gen CPUGPU offerings. These are the only 2 GPU-specific benchmarks tested by the user. Next up, was have a whole list of CPU-intensive tests which start with Cinebench. The specific version is not mentioned, but based on the scores, it looks like Cinebench R23 is being used since the score is too high for the new R24 version. The 17 watts Intel Lunar Lake Core Ultra 200V CPU scored 8,182 points here, while the 30 watts config scored 10,212 points, a 25% uplift. For Crossmark, Geekbench 5, WebExpert 4, and Speedometer, the performance between the 17 watts and 30 watts configurations is nearly identical. Was also don't know if the numbers somehow got mixed up, because in GB5.4, the 17 watts config scores better than the 30 watts config. So yeah, a word of caution to take these numbers with a grain of salt, but let's move over to the next segment, which explores the power figures. For the power numbers, was see a comparison between the 17 watts Lunar Lake Core Ultra 200 volts CPU and the current Gen Core Ultra 7165U, LPDDR5 746732GB, chip at 15 watts, base power. Here, the Lunar Lake chip at 17 watts with the best power efficiency mode scores a 45% higher efficiency across all test cases, and the balanced mode config is around 441% more efficient. So really good results, but once again, these numbers might be based on engineering samples, and performance figures can vary a lot between these and the final retail chips. AMD has a strong Zen 5 portfolio coming out next month, while Lunar Lake starts shipping in retail in September, so Intel needs to fine-tune its next-gen thin and light solutions so that it has a fighting chance against a product that's almost as performant and has showcased some great efficiency figures.